In just 7 minutes, a black congresswoman stood her ground against a room full of power and exposed a truth that shook Washington. She wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that room. Not with them. But there she was, Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, unwavering, and unforgiving in the face of decades-old injustice, wrapped in polished suits and hidden agendas. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And in one brutal exchange, she didn't just speak. She roared. It wasn't just about politics. It was about every black mother who never got an answer. Every child whose life was dismissed as a statistic. Every man who was told to be quiet and grateful. It was 7 minutes, but it echoed like a lifetime. This story is a dramatized interpretation inspired by real individuals and events. While some elements have been fictionalized for narrative purposes, the emotions, the struggles, and the truths it touches upon, they're as real as the air we breathe. And so it begins, not in the halls of Congress, but in a dusty courtroom in Texas, where a young Jasmine Crockett first learned what justice really costs. The sunlight streamed through the towering pillars of Capitol Hill, its rays cutting through the thick air of Washington, D.C., casting long shadows on the polished floors of the Senate. In this hallowed place where decisions were made and futures decided, one woman walked with purpose, Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't just another politician. She was different. She was a force, a black woman in a sea of power that had never been made for people like her. And yet, here she was. Every step she took reverberated with the weight of history. Generations of voices who had been silenced, communities broken by injustice, and the countless fights that had been waged for rights denied. But Jasmine was here not to be a spectator. She wasn't here to play by the rules of the system that had long kept the powerful in control. She was here to challenge it, to make the system answer for the countless people it had wronged. She was ready to fight. As she entered the corridors of Capitol Hill, Jasmine could feel the weight of the stairs. Whispers followed her like a shadow. There were those who doubted her, who didn't believe someone like her could ever truly make an impact in a place so steeped in tradition and privilege. But Jasmine had lived her life fighting against those doubts. She had been underestimated for as long as she could remember. Her every step, her every word questioned, simply because of the color of her skin, because of her gender. But that never stopped her. In fact, it only fueled her. She knew the political landscape was hostile. She knew that many in the room would see her as an outsider, a challenger who didn't belong. But what they didn't understand was that Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her community, for every person who had been told they weren't enough, who had been pushed to the margins and left behind. This was her moment to give them a voice. The committee room was like a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, each face in the room a symbol of the very system she sought to challenge. Yet Jasmine stood tall, her voice steady despite the nerves that churned inside her. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She knew this was what she had been called to do. When Jasmine spoke, it wasn't just her words that carried weight. It was the fire in her eyes, the raw emotion in her voice, and the truth behind every sentence. She spoke of the brokenness in the system, the laws that had been designed to keep certain people in power while others suffered. She spoke for the families who had been torn apart by injustice, for the children who had been ignored, for the communities that had been left to fend for themselves. Her words hit hard, like thunder in a storm, shaking the room to its core. But even as she spoke, Jasmine knew the fight wasn't over. The room was filled with those who would fight back, those who would try to undermine her, but they didn't understand. They didn't know what it meant to be the underdog, to rise against overwhelming odds, to push for change when everything around you told you it was impossible. Jasmine had seen that fight before, in the eyes of the people who had trusted her, and she wouldn't stop now. She wasn't here to ask for permission. She was here to demand justice, and she would fight for it with every ounce of her being. The first time Jasmine Crockett took the mic in a heated floor debate, you could feel the shift in the room, a storm gathering behind her words. She wasn't just presenting facts. She was wielding them like weapons, carving through centuries of silence and sanitization. It was a bill about housing reforms, something bland and bureaucratic on paper. But what Jasmine saw was another leash tightening around the throats of working-class black families in her district. So she stood, not to be heard, but to be felt. Her voice cracked through the chamber, cool but sharp like shattered glass. Do not tell me this policy is colorblind. Do not stand in this room of polished suits and manufactured civility and pretend that this isn't strategic displacement. Gasps, raised eyebrows. Someone muttered, "She's playing the race card." She heard it. She always did. But instead of flinching, she locked eyes with the man who said it, a senior congressman with 3 decades of tenure and zero shame, and held her stare until he looked away. Her speech trended within hours. Some called her brave, others reckless. But behind closed doors, the backlash was immediate. Anonymous messages, a sudden audit of her campaign funds, whispered threats disguised as advice. Tone it down. Play the long game. Pick your battles. But Jasmine had already made her choice. All in or not at all. Her next appearance was before a powerful committee reviewing criminal justice reform. This time the room was even colder, figuratively and literally. The air conditioning blasted down like winter in July, as if to freeze out whatever fire she brought in with her. The chairman, a man who smiled like a crocodile, let her speak last, strategically. By the time it was her turn, most had tuned out, phones glowing in their palms. But Jasmine, again, didn't flinch. She opened with a statistic about wrongful convictions and closed with the story of a 16-year-old boy from Dallas, gunned down while unarmed. His name was Malik. He was walking home from school. His crime? Wearing the wrong hoodie in the wrong zip code. No one applauded. No one moved. But the silence felt heavier than any standing ovation. Jasmine had pierced through their armor of detachment. That night, as she walked to her car, something felt off. A black SUV idled 2 rows down in the garage. Headlights flicked on. Jasmine stopped. The engine revved, then peeled away into the night. No plates, no witnesses, just a message. You're getting too loud. But fear had no room in her chest. The next morning, she posted a photo of Malik's hoodie on her official page. No caption, just the image. It went viral in under an hour. Still, the wounds began to accumulate. Her team shrank. Staffers burned out. Donors pulled back. You're too divisive, one had said. You're making enemies faster than allies. But Jasmine didn't want allies who only stood beside her when it was safe. She wanted warriors. Then came her first legislative victory, a small but powerful amendment buried deep in a public safety bill that banned the use of facial recognition tech in low-income neighborhoods. It was a crack in the wall, but a crack nonetheless, enough to let the light in. But victories don't come without scars, and Jasmine's were beginning to show. Not in the way she dressed or walked or even spoke, but in the stillness of her eyes when the cameras turned off. That's where the weight of the fight lived, and she knew this was just the beginning. Jasmine Crockett knew the storm had finally noticed her. The whispers that used to brush past her in marble corridors now grew into roars behind slammed doors. Emails from colleagues were shorter, colder. Her name stopped appearing on lunch invites and policy roundtables. Instead, it began showing up in Fox News segments, cropped into thumbnails with headlines like, "Radical Voice of Division" and "The Real Threat Inside Congress." She wasn't just being watched, she was being framed. It escalated after she questioned the integrity of a billion-dollar policing contract tied to a private prison lobby. The hearing had barely started when she called out a line item hidden deep in the proposal, one that allowed for the acquisition of riot containment tools for use in unrest-prone districts. Jasmine leaned into the mic. Define unrest-prone. Or are we just saying black zip codes now with corporate approval? Silence, then chaos. Men in tailored suits shifted uncomfortably. A senior representative tried to interrupt, but she raised her hand sharply. I'm not yielding. Not on this. The clip aired that night. Again, she trended. But this time something was different. Her office phones didn't just ring with support. They rang with threats, real ones. You don't shut up, you'll disappear. We know where your mama lives. One voicemail said only, tick, tick, tick. Security was called. Her team beefed up protections. But Jasmine didn't retreat. Instead, she showed up the next day in the same building, wearing the same fire-red blazer, her hair tied back like a warrior preparing for battle. When an aide asked if she felt safe, she smiled without warmth. "I didn't come here to be safe. I came here to fight." Behind the scenes, attempts to silence her became more sophisticated. A manufactured ethics complaint appeared on her record, accusing her of hostile conduct during committee. It was based on a moment when she had demanded an apology after being referred to as overly emotional by a fellow congressman. Her only reply to the ethics board was simple: "I'm emotional when they bury our kids and call it collateral. I'm emotional when justice has an expiration date for us and a golden parachute for them. If that makes me unfit, then maybe this whole system is broken." Every battle made her tougher, but every battle left marks. Jasmine began sleeping with her phone on her chest, afraid to miss a midnight alert. She stopped attending certain functions, not out of fear, but out of principle. She wouldn't fake smiles at cocktail parties with people who voted against her community's survival. In meetings, she spoke less, but her silence was weaponized, deliberate, terrifying. People began to realize that Jasmine didn't just make noise, she made moves. Then one evening, as she walked out of a late session, a small folded piece of paper was slipped under her windshield wiper. No name. Just a warning. They're not just trying to shut you up. They're setting you up. Inside was a list of lobbying firms tied to her political opponents, some of which were already planting stories about her in the media. She took the paper, slid it into her pocket, and drove off without turning on the radio. Her mind was already racing. If they wanted war, she'd give it to them, but on her terms. This wasn't just politics anymore. This was personal. And Jasmine Crockett had just stepped fully into the fire. Not to burn, but to burn the lies down. Washington, D.C. looked polished from a distance. Marble columns, clean suits, manicured lies. But the deeper Jasmine Crockett waded into its halls, the more it smelled like rot. The swamp wasn't just a metaphor. It was a living, breathing beast, stitched together with lobbyist money, media manipulation, and silent threats whispered between handshakes. And Jasmine had just become its most inconvenient truth. The morning after the anonymous warning, she walked into the Capitol with a storm behind her eyes. Her assistant tried to hand her a meeting schedule. She waved it off. There were whispers in the hallway. The same people who used to nod politely now refused to meet her gaze. A senior Democrat, one she once admired, brushed past her in the elevator and muttered under his breath, "You picked the wrong fight, Crockett." She turned slowly, locking eyes with him. Number that I picked the only fight that matters. Inside her office, stacks of documents had been mysteriously misplaced. An urgent bill she co-sponsored was suddenly delayed in committee. No reason, just held in bureaucratic limbo. Her emails went unanswered. Her press appearances were abruptly canceled. One network producer told her off the record, "There's heat on your name." From above, we're told to cool it. But Jasmine wasn't cooling anything. She called a staff meeting and locked the door. On the whiteboard, she wrote one word in capital letters: swamp. Then she drew lines, connecting lobbyists, PACs, corrupt city contracts, private prison kickbacks, and the names of politicians who smiled too easily. At the center of the web was a name circled in red: Dan Crenshaw, once a war hero, now a political warlord. Behind the scenes, Crenshaw's fingerprints were all over the machinations working against her. He'd publicly clashed with her before, disguising contempt behind sarcastic respect. But now it was personal. He was funding dark money ads targeting her district, subtly painting her as radical and dangerous, while privately aligning with corporations who profited off the suffering of communities like hers. She dug deeper, fast. At 2 a.m., alone in her apartment lit only by the blue glow of her laptop screen, Jasmine uncovered a shell company, Cypress Global Initiatives, linked to multiple Crenshaw donors. The company had quietly purchased real estate in impoverished neighborhoods across 3 states, right before police budgets in those cities were tripled. Coincidence? Jasmine didn't believe in those anymore. The deeper she went, the uglier it got, and the more they came for her. Anonymous emails warned her to watch where you dig. One message included a photo of her niece leaving school. Another had a pixelated image of her childhood home in Texas, with the caption, "Some roots are better left buried." She reported it to Capitol Police. Their response was bureaucratic and flat. "We'll look into it." No urgency, no protection, no justice. That night, as rain lashed against her office windows, Jasmine stared at the conspiracy map on her wall. Her hand hovered over a red pin, ready to connect the final thread. She didn't flinch. "They built this swamp with fear," she whispered, "but I won't drown in it. I'll drain it with truth." In that moment, Jasmine Crockett made a silent vow. She wasn't just exposing corruption. She was declaring war on a system that had fed on silence for too long. By the time Jasmine returned to her office the next morning, the vultures were already circling. A scandalous headline screamed from her desk: "Crockett's Radical Ties, the Hidden Danger in Congress?" The article, strategically released across fringe and mainstream platforms alike, quoted anonymous insiders, twisted old college activism into accusations of extremism, and cherry-picked sound bites to paint her as anti-American. Her phone lit up with texts, emails, calls from so-called allies, asking one common question: is it true? None of them asked if she was okay. This wasn't politics. This was war by character assassination. The air in the Capitol felt heavier now. Jasmine walked through its halls like a soldier behind enemy lines. Every smile felt rehearsed, every handshake a trap. Even within her own party, she began to see the fracture lines. Colleagues she had once marched beside during protests now distanced themselves. "It's too hot right now," one whispered behind closed doors. "We've got midterms coming." Still, not everyone turned away. Enter Malcolm Reyes, an independent from Arizona with a reputation for punching up. Grizzled, skeptical, and fiercely unbought, Malcolm knocked on Jasmine's office door without an appointment and stepped in like he owned the floor. "They're scared of you," he said bluntly, tossing the headline on her desk. "That's how you know you're close to something real." He'd seen this tactic before, he told her. Manufactured smears, targeted discrediting, isolating the threat before bearing the truth. "You've got a choice," he added. "Play nice and survive, or burn their house down with facts." Jasmine looked him dead in the eyes. "Then let's get the gasoline." With Malcolm's help, she began rebuilding her coalition. Not with polished politicians, but with fighters, community leaders, whistleblowers, a young tech analyst who once worked inside a government contractor tied to Cypress Global. Slowly, the puzzle came into focus. Real estate takeovers, police militarization, prison profiteering, all fueled by legislation that passed without debate, hidden in the fine print, signed off by men like Crenshaw. But allies came with agendas. Simone Adler, a powerful lobbyist from a progressive PAC, offered Jasmine airtime on major networks, digital campaigns, and donor funding. But there was a catch. "We frame the story our way," Simone said smoothly. "You become our symbol, our lightning rod, but you follow the script." Jasmine's heart clenched. Once again, truth was being brokered like currency. She thanked Simone and said she'd think about it. She wouldn't sell her fire to anyone. Later that night, she sat alone with Malcolm in a darkened office. "What if I can't tell this story my way?" she asked. "What if they own every mic and every camera?" Malcolm smirked. "Then we build our own damn stage." And that's exactly what they did. Jasmine launched an independent channel, raw, unfiltered, streaming from a humble setup in her office. Her first video, titled "The Swamp Doesn't Want You to See This," went viral overnight. People weren't just watching, they were marching, writing, organizing. Communities from coast to coast saw themselves in her words, not as victims, but as proof that someone in power hadn't forgotten them. But power doesn't surrender easily. With every new ally she gained, new enemies stepped forward, some cloaked in the robes of justice, others hidden behind smiles. Whispers turned to threats, and Jasmine Crockett now stood at the center of a political storm with only one thing left to lose: her silence. The first real sign came not through headlines or whispers, but through silence. Jasmine entered her office one crisp morning and immediately knew something was off. Her assistant's chair was empty. No coffee, no morning brief. The lights flickered faintly, and the air was unnaturally still. She reached for her laptop and found the screen black. When it arrived, they discovered a breach. Her private files accessed, her encrypted folders wiped clean. Someone had come for her receipts. Within hours, the locks on her apartment were changed without notice. The landlord claimed it was a miscommunication, but the look in his eyes betrayed fear, not error. Her phone began receiving calls with no voice on the other end, sometimes just static, other times a soft breathing sound. Then came the package, no return address. Inside was a single bullet, gleaming silver under the dim light of her kitchen. Taped to the bottom was a note scrawled in jagged pen. "You don't belong in the dark." Jasmine wasn't afraid of shadows. She'd lived in them her whole life. But this was no longer politics. This was personal. She reported it all, every threat, every breach, but the responses were robotic, rehearsed. Capitol Police filed the report. Nothing happened. A trusted colleague quietly pulled her aside and murmured, "Some battles aren't meant to be fought in the open, Jasmine. Watch your back." That night she slept with her shoes on, but fear didn't paralyze her. It clarified her purpose. If they wanted her quiet, it meant she was on the right trail. With Malcolm's help, she retraced every step of their investigation, this time off-grid. They worked out of a borrowed basement in a church on the edge of D.C., surrounded by flickering candles and humming old servers. There, the truth unraveled fast. Cypress Global wasn't just funding police contracts, they were steering local elections, bribing city officials, and suppressing Black and brown communities with ruthless precision. And somehow, Crenshaw's fingerprints kept reappearing. Old photos, discreet meetings, legislation he co-authored that mirrored Cypress's interests, word for word. Jasmine knew she had to go public, but she also knew the moment she did, the threats would escalate. She started receiving photos of her family, her sister leaving work, her mother at church. No words, just images. A message wrapped in silence. "We see you. We can reach them too." She stood at the edge of her fear, torn between protecting her people and confronting the machine. That's when an unlikely source reached out, an ex-staffer of Crenshaw's, racked with guilt and seeking redemption. "He's planning something big," they warned. "He knows you're getting close, and he's setting a trap. Public humiliation, a planted leak, something to end you." Jasmine stared at the message, the words burning into her vision. This wasn't just about her career anymore. It was a war for narrative, and she was inches from being erased. But instead of retreating, she went live. That night from the basement bunker, she broadcasted raw footage, internal memos, voices of whistleblowers. "If anything happens to me," she said into the camera, "let this be the truth they can't bury." It was electric. Millions watched, and more importantly, millions believed. But as her face flickered on screens across America, a black SUV rolled slowly past her mother's house. Windows tinted, engine silent, watching, waiting. The morning after Jasmine's broadcast, the city didn't wake up. It trembled. Overnight, her expose had ignited a wildfire across the internet. Hashtags surged. Late-night hosts replayed her monologue. For a fleeting moment, truth had the microphone. But in the shadows, a darker script was already being written. And Jasmine knew too well. When powerful men are exposed, they don't go quietly. They erase. It started subtly. News outlets began publishing new findings about Jasmine's past. Fabricated stories of unpaid taxes, anonymous sources alleging staff mistreatment, even manipulated footage painting her as unhinged during heated debates. Within 48 hours, the narrative flipped from hero to liability. A major network canceled her scheduled appearance. A smear blog headlined, "Crockett cracks, Congresswoman or con?" The phone calls returned. This time a voice whispered, "Should have stayed in your lane." But Jasmine had no lane. She bulldozed through roads no one gave her permission to walk. And she wasn't alone. Malcolm was working triple shifts, cross-referencing whistleblower documents against corporate tax filings, while Chloe, her quiet, steel-nerved intern, intercepted an email from a PR firm hired by Cypress Global detailing a plan to destroy Jasmine's credibility. They called it Operation Smokeout. Buried in the metadata, Chloe found something explosive. A trail of payments from Cyprus to a shell pack, which then funneled money into the campaign accounts of over a dozen lawmakers, including Dan Crenshaw. One of the payments, dated just days before Crenshaw introduced legislation that would have directly benefited Cyprus's security division. The paper trail was damning, but it was locked behind legal jargon and encrypted memos. They needed a translator, someone from inside. That's when the second whistleblower reached out. He didn't give a name, just a time, a place, and a phrase. The swamp's got teeth. Jasmine met him alone in a parking garage beneath an abandoned mall outside of Arlington. He emerged from the shadows, face hidden beneath a hoodie, hands trembling as he passed her a flash drive. It's not just money, he said. It's surveillance, coercion, blackmail. They're not trying to win votes. They're trying to own fear. As he disappeared into the dark, Jasmine turned toward the exit and froze. A man stood at the top of the stairs, phone in hand, pretending to scroll. His eyes never left her. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. She didn't run, but she didn't walk either. She moved with calculated urgency, keys gripped between her knuckles. When she got into her car, she locked the doors and drove without turning the radio on, headlights cutting through the silence. That night, she, Malcolm, and Chloe poured through the flash drive. The files were dense: emails, payment ledgers, surveillance logs. But one folder stood out: Garnet. Inside, they found photos of activists, journalists, and politicians, each file labeled, ranked, and tagged with cryptic threat levels. Jasmine's file was labeled Priority Red, neutralized before Q3. It hit her like ice in the lungs. She wasn't just a target, she was a deadline. But fear gave way to fury. They think they can kill the story by killing the storyteller, she whispered. Then let's make sure the story spreads faster than they can bury it. She uploaded a single image from the drive to her social media, a redacted page showing Garnet and the list of coded names. No caption, no explanation. Within minutes, it went viral, and somewhere in D.C., someone picked up a burner phone and said 4 cold words: move up the timeline. Jasmine had always known that politics wasn't a battleground, it was a masquerade. Everyone wore a mask. Some hid cowardice behind polished smiles, others cloaked ambition and patriotism. But now the stakes were no longer rhetorical. The moment she exposed Project Garnet to the world, the line between friend and foe dissolved, and every hallway she walked became a potential ambush. The next morning, she entered the Capitol, flanked by Malcolm and Chloe, both watching their surroundings like bodyguards, not staffers. Jasmine's post had gone nuclear overnight. Millions of views, retweets from celebrities, anonymous accounts demanding she release the full files. But with visibility came vulnerability. She didn't need whispers to know she was being watched. She could feel it. The elevator up to her office felt colder. Aides she'd worked with for years avoided her eyes. One of them, a woman who used to share coffee every Thursday, now kept her door shut tight. Inside, Jasmine found her inbox flooded with urgent scheduling corrections, and 3 of her meetings had mysteriously vanished from the public calendar. Still, it wasn't until the Oversight Committee convened that she felt the knife twist. Dan Crenshaw was waiting, his posture casual, his tone civil. But behind his words there was venom. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said smoothly, "some are suggesting that your recent posts may have endangered national security, that you're distributing unverified and potentially doctored information. Would you like to explain to the American people why you're undermining the integrity of this institution?" Jasmine stared at him, unblinking. "Is that a question or a warning?" The chamber buzzed with unease. Crenshaw smiled without humor. "It's an opportunity for you to admit you're in over your head." She didn't answer, but in that silence she saw it, the performance. Crenshaw knew she had real evidence. His calm was calculated. He wasn't trying to disprove her. He was buying time to discredit her before she could strike harder. And then came the dagger, a letter from an internal House committee opening an ethics investigation into Jasmine's conduct, leaked to the press within minutes. Suddenly, she wasn't a whistleblower. She was a rogue operative under investigation. That night, Chloe discovered the source of the leak, someone inside Jasmine's own team. A staffer named Troy, young, charming, and previously unremarkable, had forwarded her office's internal calendar and security logs to a third-party server traced to a shell firm in Delaware. When confronted, Troy didn't deny it. "You're going to get people hurt," he said, voice trembling, but resolute. "You think you're fighting the system, but you're burning down trust. They offered me protection. I took it." He was escorted out, but the damage had been done. Jasmine now understood. Her enemies weren't just outside the building. They were seated beside her, drinking the same coffee, wearing the same pins. Some believed in the system. Others were bought by it. And the cruelest part? Many truly thought they were saving America by silencing her. That night, she sat alone in her office, lights off, watching the reflection of the Capitol dome in her window. She thought about her father's warnings, her mother's prayers, the people who had told her she'd never last in this arena. But she wasn't here to last. She was here to fight. A message buzzed onto her encrypted phone. It was from the first whistleblower. "They're planning something bigger. You need to move fast. Trust no one, not even the ones wearing your colors." She stared at the screen, heart pounding. Enemies weren't just in disguise. They were already inside the gates. And somewhere deep beneath D.C., another message was being typed on a secured line. "Stage 2 protocol approved. Begin containment." The sky over D.C. had never looked darker. It wasn't just the storm rolling in. It was the silence before something catastrophic. Jasmine stood on the steps of the Capitol, the weight of betrayal and truth pressing hard against her chest. Her encrypted files were ready, her statement rehearsed. She had scheduled a live-stream press conference to reveal everything. Names, documents, surveillance footage. Everything they had buried. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Too easy. Too quiet. An hour before the broadcast, Chloe rushed into her office, phone in hand, face pale. "Jazz, someone just accessed the backup server. The whole drive's gone. Wiped. Not corrupted. Erased." Jasmine didn't panic. She couldn't afford it. "What about the duplicates?" "Offline. Dead. We checked the vault. The hardware's missing." Her stomach turned cold. Only 5 people knew about that vault. 2 of them had been with her since her city council days. The other 3, well, one had already betrayed her. She looked at Malcolm, who stood in the doorway like a stone pillar. "How deep do you think this goes?" He didn't blink. "They're not just scared, Jasmine. They're mobilizing." At 6:42 p.m., 38 minutes before she was set to go live, Jasmine's face appeared on every major network, except she wasn't speaking. It was a deep fake. Grainy footage of her edited voice admitting she had fabricated evidence, calling it a political stunt, and worse, claiming she was working with foreign intelligence. The networks ran it as breaking news, flashing red banners, screaming, "Confession." "What the hell?" Chloe gasped. Jasmine tried to call the legal team, the press office, even their last resort media allies. No one picked up. A nationwide smear campaign had detonated in real time, coordinated with military precision. Then came the knock. 4 men in dark suits entered the office uninvited. Badges flashed. Department of Homeland Security. "Congresswoman Crockett," the one in front said flatly, "we have a warrant to detain you under suspicion of disseminating classified information and compromising national security." Chloe stepped forward. "This is unconstitutional. She's a sitting member of Congress." The lead agent cut her off. "Emergency protocols override standing protections." Jasmine didn't flinch. "This is a coup. Just without guns." They didn't respond. They didn't have to. She raised her hand slowly. "Let me get my coat." In the back room, Malcolm handed her a black flash drive. "Last copy, hidden behind the decoy logs. Use it wisely." "Are you coming?" she asked. "No," he said, jaw clenched. "They'll expect me to fold if they take me. I'll buy you time." They embraced like soldiers before battle, knowing one wouldn't return. Jasmine emerged with her head high, surrounded by cameras now swarming like vultures outside. She was escorted out like a traitor, her name already smeared, her story twisted beyond recognition. But inside her coat pocket was the last piece of truth, and inside her chest, the fire burned hotter than ever. By midnight, Chloe had vanished. Malcolm had been relocated to an undisclosed facility. And Jasmine Crockett, once a rising star of the progressive left, had become a national enemy in less than 6 hours. But they had underestimated her, because while they controlled the airwaves, the headlines, and the armed men with badges, Jasmine still controlled the narrative. And this wasn't the end. This was the tipping point. Jasmine Crockett hadn't slept in 2 days. The safe house she'd been smuggled into was a decaying townhouse on the outskirts of Baltimore. The kind of place that looked abandoned, even when it wasn't. The peeling wallpaper, the humming of faulty electricity, and the stench of mildew clung to everything like guilt. She sat by the window, barely breathing, watching every shadow like it was the last thing she might ever see. Outside, unmarked cars passed too slowly. Drones buzzed somewhere overhead. The silence wasn't safe. It was a trap waiting to spring. Her burner phone vibrated once, twice. Then it rang. A voice, gravel thick, steady, and old enough to carry weight, spoke without greeting. "Jasmine, it's Crenshaw." Congressman Elijah Crenshaw was a legend, one of the last true lions in a house full of lapdogs. He never called unless it was serious. And if he was calling now, it meant the walls were closing in faster than she feared. "Where the hell have you been?" she hissed, pulling the curtain aside just enough to scan the street. "They've erased me. They turned Malcolm into a ghost. Chloe's missing. They think they've won." His voice remained calm but carried an urgency that cut through her panic. "They haven't, but they will. Unless you move now." "I've got the last drive," she said. "The real one. The deep fake won't hold up, but they've destroyed everything that could prove it was fake. We're running out of time." "I know, that's why you're not staying put," Crenshaw replied. "Listen carefully. There's a safe route out through Route 7. One contact, no names. You'll be met at the abandoned switching station near the state line. You have 20 minutes. "Are you helping me escape?" Jasmine whispered, as if saying it too loud would set off alarms. "This sounds like exile." Crenshaw paused. "It's not exile. It's repositioning. You've become too dangerous for them to leave standing, and too vital for us to lose." She bit her lip, fury swelling beneath her fear. "I didn't come this far to run. I wanted justice. Now they've painted me like a traitor. And if you go down now, they'll rewrite every page of this story," Crenshaw said. "You're not running. You're surviving long enough to fight back." The call ended. No goodbye. Just silence. And a choice. Jasmine moved like a soldier on instinct. Flash drive taped inside her boot. A change of clothes. A Beretta she wasn't sure she could fire. Out the back, down 2 alleys, into the shadows. A black sedan was waiting near the overpass. Engine idling. No license plate. The driver didn't speak. Just handed her a burner radio and started driving like the devil himself was behind them. But the devil wasn't behind them. He was already ahead. At the switching station, lights flickered. Jasmine stepped out slowly, every muscle wound tight. Then, gunfire. Sharp, sudden. The driver fell before he could react. She hit the ground, rolled behind a rusted pillar. More shots. Not random. Trained. Precise. A voice crackled through the radio. "Get to the north tunnel. Run now. Don't stop." Jasmine didn't hesitate. She sprinted through the dark, bullets ricocheting off metal. Heart pounding, lungs burning. She didn't look back. This wasn't an escape. It was war. And somewhere in the shadows of power, her enemies were already preparing their next move. The train roared past in a blur of rust and noise, shaking the loose bolts of the old maintenance tunnel where Jasmine Crockett crouched beneath concrete and steel. Her hoodie was soaked with sweat, grime clung to her hands, and every breath tasted like copper and fear. But she was alive. For now. Above ground, she was a fugitive. "Armed and dangerous," said the news. "Mentally unstable," according to the whisper campaigns. One pundit even claimed she was part of a foreign coup. The headlines weren't just lies. They were weapons designed to erase her truth and bury her under a narrative built on fear. She gritted her teeth, pushing deeper into the narrow passage, guided only by a flickering flashlight and a mental map burned into her brain from a single desperate briefing. Every turn of this underground labyrinth was a gamble. One wrong step, and she'd walk straight into the arms of those who wanted her silenced forever. Her radio crackled to life. Checkpoint Alpha clear. You've got 20 minutes before grid shift. Do not miss it. It was the only voice she trusted now. Monk, a disgraced cyber warfare operative turned ghost. He owed her his freedom. She was cashing in the debt. Copy, Jasmine whispered. Her voice was hoarse. She hadn't spoken aloud in hours. She emerged in an abandoned substation, the fluorescent lights above long dead. Power cables hung like vines from the ceiling, swaying gently in the stale air. On a table sat her next disguise. Work overalls, fake credentials, and a janitor's badge for a corporate facility tied to the same defense contractor that funded the illegal ops she'd uncovered. It was a trap within a trap, but also the only place she could plant the last piece of evidence and expose the truth. As she changed, her hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury. Every step she took reminded her of what they'd stolen: her reputation, her career, her brother's life. And still, no justice. Just more men in suits moving pawns around, hoping she'd disappear. Outside, a maintenance van waited. Monk had left the keys under the seat. No questions, just wheels. She drove like a ghost, slow, unnoticed, invisible, past the patrols, past the roadblocks, past the world that had turned its back on her. The facility loomed ahead, surrounded by razor wire fences and concrete paranoia. But her ID scanned green. Her face, digitally altered just enough, passed without a blink. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Cameras followed her every move. But Jasmine moved like she belonged. No hesitation, no fear, until she reached sub-level 3. That's where she saw him. Agent Nolan, the bastard in the suit, the man who'd smiled as her life burned. He didn't recognize her yet, but his presence here meant one thing. They knew she was coming. Or worse, they wanted her to come. She swallowed hard, pushing her cart past him. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, just sipped his coffee and turned back to a security monitor. But Jasmine knew what that look meant. He was waiting, letting her walk deeper into the lion's den. She reached the server room, slipped inside, locked the door, heart pounding. Flash drive in, firewall breach, upload initiated. Then, red lights, sirens, footsteps. They were coming. She yanked the drive out, slammed the server casing shut, and sprinted to the emergency exit. No more silence. No more shadows. They wanted her gone? She would show them what a real threat looked like. The countdown echoed in Jasmine's mind as she sprinted through the labyrinth of sterile hallways, the pulse of her footsteps matching the ticking clock inside her head. She didn't look back. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, adrenaline flooding her veins as she burst through the emergency exit, only to be met by the cold, oppressive air of the parking lot. The van. She had to make it to the van. But just as she rounded the corner, the sharp sound of gunshots shattered the night, followed by the unmistakable squeal of tires skidding to a halt. The van. It was already blocked off. "Drop it!" a voice barked from behind her. Jasmine froze. She didn't turn to face the threat, but she could hear the unmistakable cadence of Agent Nolan's voice cutting through the chaos. He was everywhere now, like a ghost in the machine. He had orchestrated this, and now it was clear he wanted her to face the consequences of everything she had exposed. She turned sharply, eyes locking onto the barrel of a rifle aimed directly at her. The guards flanking him moved into position. She was trapped. But Jasmine didn't blink. Her mind raced, her eyes scanning the surroundings for an escape. A way to shift the odds in her favor. Her gaze landed on the electrical panel near the building entrance. An easy way to disable the cameras. Take the lights down. But first, she needed to buy herself some time. "You're making a mistake, Nolan," she said, her voice steady, but her muscles coiled like springs ready to explode. "You don't want to do this." Nolan sneered, stepping closer, his eyes filled with icy calculation. "It's too late for you, Crockett. This game is over." "Maybe for you," she shot back. Then with a sudden movement, flung herself to the side, diving behind a nearby stack of crates. The shot that followed was too close, too loud. Jasmine's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. Her training kicked in. She couldn't just run. She wouldn't. She wasn't the type to hide. Not anymore. Not after everything they had taken from her new position, She drew her sidearm, the cold metal now a comforting weight in her palm. She didn't have much time. She knew she needed to make it to the electrical panel. It was the only way to turn the tide. With a deep breath, she darted from cover, weaving between parked cars and scattered debris. The guards opened fire, but she was faster, slipping through their line of fire like a shadow in the dark. A bullet grazed her arm, but she kept running, pushing through the pain. "She's still alive," one of the guards yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Nolan's voice rang out, demanding control. "Don't let her get to the panel. Keep her contained." Jasmine's heart raced as she neared the electrical box. She reached for the panel, her fingers slick with sweat and blood. But before she could make contact, a sharp pain exploded in her side. She gritted her teeth and spun, barely able to see through the blood clouding her vision. Nolan was there, right in front of her, his cold eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I told you, Crockett. It's over." But Jasmine's anger, burning brighter than any wound, refused to die. "I'm not finished," she growled through clenched teeth. With a violent surge of adrenaline, she kicked the panel open, and in one swift motion, ripped the wires loose. The building went dark. No more cameras. No more lights. Just the deafening silence of their impending defeat. In the dark, the chase turned into a fight for survival. She could hear Nolan's footsteps as he closed in. He was determined to end this. But Jasmine wasn't finished. With the power down, everything shifted. Jasmine had become the predator, not the prey. She pushed forward, staying low, using the shadows to her advantage. She heard Nolan shout for backup, but his voice faltered as he realized she wasn't where he expected. Then in the pitch black of the parking lot, she heard it. The sound of something moving behind her. A breath, then another. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror of a van, catching a fleeting image. Two guards silently closing in on her from opposite ends. Jasmine inhaled deeply, grounding herself. They had thought they had her cornered, but now it was their turn to be hunted. With an explosive burst of energy, she bolted toward the entrance, gun in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The showdown had only just begun. The storm had arrived. Not the kind of storm that raged with wind and rain, but the kind that stirred the public, the kind that turned the world upside down and left nothing but chaos in its wake. Jasmine could feel the weight of it in the pit of her stomach as the media frenzy erupted. Every outlet, every journalist, every armchair analyst, all obsessed with her latest move. She had hoped to stay under the radar, but the past few hours had undone that hope completely. Now she was no longer just a target for the people who wanted to bring her down. She was a symbol of defiance, a symbol of everything the public didn't want to face. The phone in her hand buzzed with a dozen notifications, each one more damning than the last. Headlines screamed her name. Fugitive on the run, whistleblower turned rogue, criminal mastermind. The injustice of it all burned through her like a fire. She wasn't the villain. She was the one exposing the truth, pulling back the curtains on a corrupt system that had been hiding in plain sight. But now all they saw was a traitor. Her hands shook as she dropped the phone onto the bed. It felt like the walls were closing in. There was no place left to hide. The storm was in the streets, in every corner of the city, in the faces of the people who had turned against her without even knowing the whole story. They didn't care to listen. They only cared about the narrative being spun in front of them. Outside, the sirens wailed in the distance. She wasn't sure if it was the police or just another crowd rallying in protest, but it didn't matter anymore. The storm was no longer just in the news. It was everywhere. The streets were alive with the sound of angry voices, and Jasmine knew that the walls of the system were starting to crack. But would they crack enough for the truth to escape? She grabbed her coat and stormed out of the room, her eyes scanning the city below her as she made her way to the rooftop. The wind whipped through her hair, biting at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the storm in her heart. The sky above was dark, the clouds swirling as if they too had come alive in response to the chaos below. The city felt like a ticking bomb, ready to explode at any second. And Jasmine, she was the fuse. But even now, standing on the edge, the cold air pressing against her, she could feel the burning injustice inside her. She was supposed to be the one to expose the truth, to bring down the empire of lies, but instead, she had become the villain in the eyes of the people. They didn't see the sacrifices, the pain, the years of work she'd poured into this fight. They didn't see the bigger picture. The media had twisted everything. They had branded her as a criminal, a traitor to the nation. But no one was asking the right questions. No one was listening. All they cared about was the blood in the water, and Jasmine had become the shark they were eager to tear apart. Her phone buzzed again, a reminder of the world she was trying to escape. It was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before unlocking the screen, dreading what it might say. "You think you've won, but it's only just begun. They're coming for you." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected this level of betrayal. She had been set up, played by those she thought were her allies. Now they were coming for her, and she had nowhere to run. The storm had arrived, but Jasmine wasn't going to let it break her. She was going to fight back, with everything she had. Because if the system was going to tear her apart, she was going to make damn sure it knew the name of the person who would bring it down. Jasmine walked the streets, but she might as well have been a ghost. The city that once felt alive now seemed cold and distant. The faces that passed her indifferent, unaware of the chaos brewing behind her eyes. The storm had broken, and yet she felt no relief. The world was watching her every move, every breath, but no one was truly listening. She was loud, yes, her name on the tongues of thousands, her face plastered across every screen. But beneath it all, she was isolated, abandoned by those she had once trusted, left alone in a cacophony of accusations and lies. Her phone buzzed again, a constant reminder that the world had not forgotten her. Every message, every notification, every headline, a piece of the puzzle she was trying to escape, a weight that threatened to crush her with every step she took. The words were venomous, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. Criminal, traitor, manipulator. The truth was irrelevant to them now. All they wanted was someone to blame, someone to vilify, someone to tear apart. And Jasmine, whether she liked it or not, had become their scapegoat. She had no choice but to keep moving. It wasn't just the media that was after her now. It was the public, the very people she had fought to protect. Their anger was a living, breathing thing, a beast that fed on the lies that had been fed to them. It didn't matter that Jasmine had exposed the corruption that ran deep in their system. All they saw now was her betrayal. The truth she had fought for was being buried under a pile of misinformation, and she could feel herself suffocating beneath it. She took a sharp turn into an alleyway, the sounds of the city muffled by the towering buildings around her. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, she found solace for only a moment before her phone buzzed once more, snapping her back into reality. She couldn't escape it. It was too loud, too omnipresent. The accusations, the threats, the whispers, they were everywhere, suffocating her, drowning her in their noise. And yet there was no one to hear her side. No one who would stand beside her in this fight. Jasmine clenched her fists, her jaw tight with the effort to hold back the rage that surged through her. The injustice of it all, it burned. It seethed beneath her skin like fire, igniting her every thought, every move. She had been betrayed, not just by the system she had once believed in, but by the people she had trusted to fight alongside her. They had turned on her the moment the truth became too dangerous, too threatening. She had sacrificed everything for this cause, and now she stood alone, her every effort twisted and distorted by those who should have stood by her. But it wasn't just the betrayal that stung, it was the loneliness. Jasmine had been surrounded by a world of noise for so long, but now in the silence of her thoughts, she realized just how alone she truly was. No one cared about the fight she was in. No one saw the years of work she had poured into bringing the truth to light. They only saw the scandal, the story that fit the narrative they wanted to believe. They didn't care about the cost of the fight, the people who had been hurt along the way. They only cared about what was easiest to digest. And yet, despite all of this, Jasmine knew she couldn't give up. The world might have turned against her, but she would never let them take away the truth. She had come this far. She had fought this battle for so long. She wasn't going to let the noise drown her now. Her loneliness, her isolation, became her strength. The more they tried to silence her, the louder she would become. The more they tried to tear her down, the more she would rise. In the midst of the storm, she found clarity. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, the ones who had been silenced long before her. And that, no matter how loud the world became, was a fight worth everything. The letter arrived in the dead of night, its envelope crisp, the ink still fresh. It wasn't the kind of letter you expect in this day and age. There were no high-tech gadgets or flashing notifications that heralded its arrival, just a hand-delivered note that smelled faintly of smoke and old paper, as if it had traveled through fire and darkness to reach her. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before tearing it open, the air heavy with the weight of uncertainty. It was a message not just for her, but from the people she had been fighting for, the ones who had been cast aside and forgotten by the world. Inside, the words were simple, but their impact was immediate. A promise, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. They knew the truth, and now they were ready to speak. But the letter wasn't just a beacon of hope. It was a declaration of war. The stakes had escalated. The game had changed. The enemies she had been facing were no longer faceless corporations or anonymous elites. Now the battle had come to her doorstep. The letter was a symbol of something much darker, a warning that the fight she had started was far from finished. Jasmine's heart raced as she reread the words, the urgency in them ringing louder with each passing second. It was a cry from the margins, from the forgotten voices, those who had been left behind while the powerful continued to rewrite the narrative. They were the ones who had suffered in silence, their stories buried beneath the weight of corruption and lies. Now they were reaching out to her, their hope clinging to the fragile thread of her resolve. But with that hope came a heavy price. There was no going back now. The moment she took up this cause, she had crossed a line, and the enemies she had made along the way would stop at nothing to erase her from the story. Jasmine could almost feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders like 1,000 invisible hands. Every step she took felt like it was under surveillance, every action scrutinized by those who had been waiting for her to slip, for her to fall. The system she had tried to dismantle was turning its gears against her, its machinery designed to crush anyone who dared to challenge it. But the voices in the letter reminded her of something she had forgotten amidst the chaos. She was not alone. As she stood there in the silence of her apartment, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, the weight of her loneliness seemed to lift. These voices, these letters from the margins, were more than just cries for help. They were a challenge, a rallying cry that echoed through the chambers of her mind. The injustice she had faced was a testament to the power of those who controlled the narrative, who played with lives as though they were pawns on a chessboard. Jasmine had been pushed to the edges of society, cast out and vilified for daring to expose the truth. But now she was reminded that the edges held the strength of the people, the very people who had been crushed beneath the boots of the powerful, and it was their strength that would carry her forward. The letter wasn't just a symbol of the fight she had waged. It was the spark that would ignite the flames of rebellion. The truth was no longer something she carried alone. It was a fire shared by many, a blaze that would burn through the lies that had been built up over decades. Jasmine clenched her fists, feeling the fire in her chest, the fire that had been smoldering for so long. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been left behind, for everyone who had been ignored. As the night stretched on, Jasmine felt the weight of the world pressing in on her from all sides. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been. She was no longer just a target. She was a symbol of resistance. But with that symbol came danger, threats she could not ignore. The powerful would stop at nothing to destroy her, to erase everything she had worked for. And yet the truth she carried was undeniable. The world had tried to silence her, to bury her, but Jasmine was not someone who could be extinguished. She wasn't just a fighter. She was a storm waiting to break free. And now, with the letters from the margins in her hands, she knew that the storm had come. The silence was suffocating, as though the world had held its breath and was waiting for Jasmine to make her move. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message, the only sound breaking the stillness in the dimly lit room. It was a reminder that the fight was far from over. The message was brief, its tone cold, yet laced with an unmistakable threat. "You're running out of time." Jasmine gripped the phone tight, her knuckles white, the weight of the message pressing against her chest like a vice. She had become the target, but not just of the faceless enemies she had been battling for so long. No, now they were coming after everything she stood for. And the people she'd fought for? They were collateral damage in a war she hadn't asked to start. She had been pushed to the edge, cornered by forces beyond her control, but the fire inside her burned brighter with each passing second. Jasmine stood up, the intensity in her eyes matching the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. The injustice was suffocating, the system that had long been in place grinding down those who dared to stand up. It didn't matter how hard she fought. Every attempt to expose the truth seemed to lead to another dead end, another betrayal, another face in the crowd who wasn't who they claimed to be. She was walking a tightrope, teetering on the edge of ruin, but she wasn't going to fall. Not now, not after everything she had sacrificed. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a different message, one that made her blood run cold. A video. She pressed play, and there they were. Her allies, the ones she had trusted, bound and gagged in a dimly lit warehouse. Their eyes were wide with fear, their hands tied behind their backs. The man in the video, a shadowy figure she recognized but never thought she would see this way, stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "Walk away, and we'll let them go. Fight back, and we'll bury them along with your cause." Her heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't just a game anymore. This wasn't just about her or her fight for justice. This was personal. The people she had worked alongside, those who had believed in her, were now pawns in a much darker game. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The tide had shifted and she was no longer in control. But that spark in her, the one that had driven her to defy the system in the first place, flared up once more. The stakes had never been higher. The powerful had underestimated her before. They thought they could break her, bend her to their will, but they didn't know her. They didn't know that Jasmine wasn't someone who could be silenced by threats or fear. The injustice they had heaped upon her, the people they had hurt to make their point, none of it would stop her. She slammed her phone down, her breath quickening. She wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. She was fighting for her survival. She was fighting for the people who had been dragged into this mess by her cause. Jasmine's mind raced as she mapped out her next move, the pressure mounting with each passing second. If she didn't act fast, she could lose everything. The line between ally and enemy was now blurred, and everyone, even those she thought she could trust, was a potential threat. It was a game of survival, and the rules had changed. The storm that had been gathering for so long was no longer a distant rumble. It was here, crashing down around her. The tide had turned. She could feel the weight of it, the pressure rising as the forces closing in on her tightened their grip. But one thing was clear. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. She had been pushed to the brink, but the fight was far from over. The tides might have turned, but Jasmine was ready to turn them back. The war wasn't lost, not yet, and she wasn't done fighting. The air was thick with the electric tension of the moment, crackling with a promise of destruction. Jasmine stood in the center of the room, her eyes locked on the gathering storm before her. She had been broken, betrayed, hunted and silenced, but no more. Tonight everything would change. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a defiant shout against the injustice that had been dealt to her. The world had thought they could bury her under the weight of their schemes, their lies and their systems of control. But they were wrong. She would not be buried. She would rise. The heavy metal doors of the facility groaned as they opened, revealing a line of guards, weapons raised, faces cold and unfeeling. They had come to stop her, to crush her once and for all. But Jasmine, now fueled by the fire of betrayal and the agony of the past, didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her presence almost magnetic, drawing all eyes to her. "You think you can intimidate me with your guns? "With your power?" she said, her voice a low growl that rippled through the silence like a storm approaching. "You don't know who you're dealing with." A tense pause hung in the air before one of the guards barked an order. The sound of rifles being aimed echoed, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. Her defiance was more than a challenge. It was a declaration. She was no longer the hunted, she was the hunter. She had felt the burn of betrayal, the sting of losing everything, but it had only forged her resolve into something unbreakable. The guards hesitated for a split second, and that was all it took. Jasmine's hand moved faster than a striking snake, pulling the trigger on the explosive devices hidden within the room. The explosion erupted in a deafening roar, shaking the walls, sending debris flying, and drowning out all sounds but the piercing chaos. Screams filled the air, but Jasmine was already moving, a blur of motion as she dove into the heart of the chaos, weaving between pillars of smoke and fire. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with fury. The air was filled with the scent of burning metal and dust, the screams of the fallen ringing in her ears. But Jasmine felt no remorse. She had crossed the point of no return long ago. Every step she took was one further into the storm, one step closer to a reckoning that had been long overdue, and she would not back down. She sprinted, her boots pounding the ground in rhythmic defiance as she tore through the building. She didn't care if the world crumbled around her. She would bring it down herself. Her enemies had underestimated her, and now they were going to pay the price. Each corner she turned, each room she entered, more of them fell. Guards, commanders, bureaucrats. They tried to fight back, but they were too slow, too blind to see the fire in her eyes. The world had kept her in the shadows, kept her silent. But now she was the roar. The echo of her rebellion spread like wildfire, her actions sending shockwaves throughout the facility. The system she had once fought so desperately to infiltrate, to destroy, was crumbling at her feet. She could feel it. The tipping point was near. They had no idea how far she had come, how much she had endured. They had no idea what she had become. She had learned their tricks. She had seen their lies. She knew their weaknesses better than they knew their own, and now she would expose them for the world to see. As she reached the heart of the building, the final showdown awaited. The leader of this corrupt empire, the one who had been pulling the strings all along, stood there waiting for her. He was a shadow in the chaos, his cold eyes watching her every move. But Jasmine didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, every step a drumbeat of defiance. "You thought you could crush me," she said, her voice laced with venom. "You thought you could break me." The man smiled, a wicked grin playing at the edges of his lips. "You should have stayed down." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She took one last step forward, her voice a growl of fury. "You didn't break me. You made me stronger, and now I'll finish what I started." With those words, the world seemed to pause. And then, as the final battle erupted around her, Jasmine knew this was her moment. Her roar would be heard, and the world would tremble. Jasmine stood at the entrance of the grand hall, her eyes sweeping over the sea of suits and ties, the silent murmurs, and the weight of the eyes that now fell upon her. She had once been an outsider, discarded, overlooked, and shoved into the shadows of a world that didn't want her. But tonight, the world would see her for who she truly was, an unstoppable force that refused to be silenced. The room, filled with powerful figures, shifted uneasily at her arrival. Jasmine could feel their judgment as they tried to hide their discomfort behind polite smiles. They thought she was just another upstart, another casualty of a world too brutal for the weak. They had no idea what she had overcome, how she had clawed her way to this very moment. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor like the ticking of a clock. Each step was a declaration, a statement that the game was no longer theirs to control. She wasn't here to be a pawn. She was here to take the throne. The room fell silent as she made her way toward the central podium. The power players, the ones who thought they could bend the world to their will, watched her closely, their glances sharp, their postures defensive. They didn't know how to react. To them, Jasmine was an anomaly, a threat they hadn't accounted for. But Jasmine was already beyond their reach. They could no longer intimidate her. She had spent years fighting, surviving, enduring the unimaginable. She had learned their tactics, played by their rules, and now it was time to rewrite the script. As she reached the center of the room, she felt their eyes on her, judging, calculating, waiting for her to falter. But Jasmine stood tall, unyielding. She was no longer the victim. She had become the storm. A figure at the far end of the room stood and began to speak, his voice booming with arrogance. "You've come here, uninvited, with nothing but the scraps of your broken past. You think you belong here, among us?" The words were sharp, cutting, designed to wound. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her lips curled into a smile, one that was born from years of pain, years of fighting to stay alive. "I don't think I belong here," she said, her voice steady and unshaken. "I know I do." The tension in the room thickened, like the air before a storm. There was an unease that spread among the crowd, an acknowledgement that Jasmine's words were more than just bravado. They were truth. She had earned her place, and no one could take that from her. As the man continued to speak, his words dripping with disdain, Jasmine's mind raced. She had expected this, expected the derision, the ridicule, the attempts to break her down. What they didn't know was that she had already broken once before, and it had made her stronger. She could feel the weight of the injustice that had been done to her, but she refused to let it control her anymore. With a slow, deliberate motion, she placed her hand on the back of the chair in front of her, the symbol of the power she was about to claim. The room held its breath. The moment had arrived. Jasmine didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. What she needed was to prove to herself that she was no longer the woman they had tried to crush, the woman they had underestimated. She was something far greater now. With a swift, graceful motion, she took her seat at the table. The room fell completely silent. Jasmine's presence was undeniable now. She had taken her place not through manipulation or violence, but through sheer strength, resilience, and the audacity to challenge a system that had long kept her down. The world she had once been excluded from now bowed before her. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Jasmine sat at the table, her eyes cold and unwavering, her posture regal, as if the weight of her journey had prepared her for this exact moment. She had earned her seat in the world. This world that had once scorned her was now hers to command. The room had fallen silent, a silence so thick it felt suffocating, as if the very air had drawn in its breath to watch Jasmine claim what was hers. For a moment, the eyes of the room were fixed on her, some with disdain, others with fear. The same faces that had once dismissed her as a mere inconvenience were now watching with a different kind of intensity, one that spoke not of superiority, but of uncertainty. Jasmine stood tall at the podium, every inch of her body a declaration of the power she had earned through blood, sweat, and tears. Her heart pounded fiercely in her chest, not from fear, but from the sheer realization that this was it. This was the moment she had fought for, the moment where everything she had suffered, every ounce of injustice she had endured, would be turned on its head. The man who had been at the center of it all, the architect of the system that had silenced so many before her, was now standing across from her. His face, usually a mask of calm and control, was contorted with frustration. His hands clenched into fists, but there was no escaping the inevitable. Jasmine could see the fear in his eyes now. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He opened his mouth to speak, to regain control, but the words came out weak, uncertain. "You don't know what you're doing," he spat, his voice shaking with frustration. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply stood there, letting his words hang in the air like empty threats. She had heard them all before. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, her voice cold and steady, every syllable cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "I'm taking what was always mine." The room held its breath. For years, this man had manipulated, controlled, and silenced those beneath him. For years, he had convinced them that his word was the only one that mattered. But Jasmine wasn't just taking his word away. She was taking his power. She was exposing the corruption that had once been hidden in plain sight. And she was doing it not through force, not through violence, but through the truth, the one thing he could never silence. The man took a step toward her, his posture aggressive, but his eyes betrayed him. His arrogance had turned to desperation. He had thought she would back down. He had thought he could break her with his threats, with his power. But Jasmine had learned long ago that nothing and no one could break her. The world had tried to crush her spirit, to tell her that her voice didn't matter, that she was just another casualty of the system. But now she was the one holding the power. "You can't control the narrative anymore," Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. "The people have spoken. The truth has spoken. And no amount of lies or threats can change that." The man's face twisted with rage, but Jasmine wasn't afraid. The justice she sought had already begun to take root, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His power was built on lies, on manipulation, and it was all coming crashing down. He was powerless now. "You think you've won?" he sneered, the venom in his voice clear. Jasmine smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of certainty. She had won long before this moment. "No," she said, her voice calm but fierce. "I don't think I've won. I know I've won." The words echoed through the room, settling into the silence like a final verdict. She had spoken her truth, and there was no going back. The world she had once been forced to accept was no longer the world she lived in. The system that had tried to keep her down had just witnessed its last breath. As she turned to walk away from the podium, the sound of the door closing behind her was louder than any applause. It wasn't just the sound of her departure. It was the sound of an era ending. Jasmine had done what no one thought was possible. She had taken control. She had spoken the final word. And in doing so, she had redefined the very nature of power itself. And as the room slowly began to buzz with the chaos of what was to come, Jasmine knew one thing for sure. She had only just begun. In the silence that followed the gavel's echo, the weight of 1,000 unheard voices seemed to lift. Not vanish, but rise, reshaped into a force that could no longer be ignored. Jasmine stood beneath the dome of the Capitol, no longer merely a symbol of resistance, but the proof that resistance, when forged in truth and carried with courage, can bend history. Her victory was not flawless nor final, for injustice never truly sleeps, but it was enough to ignite a reckoning. It was a reminder that even in the shadows of institutions built to silence dissent, the truth has its own volume, and those who dare to speak it can rewrite the script of power. She did not fight for applause or headlines, but for those whose names were never printed, whose suffering was brushed aside, whose lives were deemed expendable in the calculus of convenience. And in doing so, she showed the world that dignity is not granted by position, but claimed through conviction. The moral is not that triumph is inevitable. It isn't. Nor that the fight is ever over. It never is. The lesson is simpler and more difficult. That when your voice shakes, but you speak anyway, when your knees tremble, but you still stand, you become more than one person facing a storm. You become the storm. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the weather. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.